Moi, Mobutu Sese Seko Kukumbendu Wazabanga. Je jure.
Mobutu Sese Seko, Congo's strongman, kleptocrat, and Cold War darling. He ruled for 32 years, looted billions, and lived like a king while his people suffered. But here's the thing. Mobutu didn't rise to power alone. His regime wasn't just tolerated by the West, it was built by it. During the Cold War, the US and Europe saw Mobutu as the perfect partner, anti-communist, pro-business, and willing to play their game. In return, they gave him money, weapons, and unwavering support, no matter the cost to Congo. But how did Mobutu turn Western support into one of the most corrupt regimes in history? And at what cost to Congo? Let's talk about the CIA. During the Cold War, their mission was simple: stop communism, no matter the cost. And Congo? It wasn't just another African country, it was a treasure chest of strategic resources. Uranium from Congo had already powered the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The West couldn't afford to lose this gold mine to the Soviets. In 1960, Congo declared independence, and Patrice Lumumba became its first prime minister. But his willingness to engage with the Soviet Union set off alarm bells in Washington. To the CIA, Lumumba wasn't just a leader, he was a threat, a ticking time bomb. And the Cold War didn't leave room for threats. This is where Mobutu enters the picture. A young army officer fluent in French and fiercely anti-communist, Mobutu had already caught the attention of Belgium, but it was the CIA that saw his true potential. He wasn't just a soldier, he was an opportunity. As Lumumba's chief of staff, Mobutu had access to critical intelligence. He played both sides, maintaining Lumumba's trust while secretly aligning himself with Western interests. The CIA saw in him a man they could mold, a man who could protect Western control over Congo's resources. The CIA's involvement in Lumumba's fall is no longer speculation. It's a documented fact. Declassified memos reveal how they funneled money and resources to Mobutu, enabling him to lead a coup against Lumumba. Their goal wasn't just to remove a leader, they wanted to eliminate a symbol of resistance. And eliminate him, they did. Lumumba was captured, tortured, and executed with the tacit approval of the US and direct involvement of Belgium. Mobutu, meanwhile, began consolidating power under the watchful eye of his Western backers. Mobutu didn't seize power all at once. After Lumumba's death, Congo descended into chaos. Regional leaders like Moise Tshombe fought for control, while foreign corporations maneuvered to secure their mining interests. Mobutu stayed in the shadows, playing the long game. In November 1965, Mobutu made his move. With CIA funding and Belgian support, he staged a second coup, declaring himself president. To the West, this wasn't just a victory, it was a masterstroke. Mobutu promised stability, anti-communism, and open access to Congo's wealth. Washington couldn't have asked for a better ally. Mobutu quickly became a darling of the West. Over the next decade, the US poured billions of dollars into his regime, providing military aid, economic support, and political cover. In return, Mobutu crushed communists, kept the Soviets out of Congo, and ensured that Western corporations continued to profit. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about geopolitics. It was about greed. Mobutu used Western support to build one of the most corrupt regimes in history. Billions in aid disappeared into Swiss bank accounts, while Congo's people lived in poverty. And the West? They turned a blind eye. Mobutu's corruption wasn't a secret. It was tolerated. As long as he served Western interests, his crimes against his own people were excused. Mobutu didn't just rise to power. He was elevated by forces far beyond Congo's borders. The CIA didn't see him as a dictator. They saw him as a tool, a means to an end in the Cold War chess game. And while they celebrated their victory, the people of Congo paid the price. But Mobutu's rise was just the beginning. Over the next 3 decades, he would turn Congo into his personal empire, draining its resources while his Western allies looked on. And the question is, how did he get away with it for so long?
Mobutu Sese Seko kukumbendu wazabanga.
The all-powerful warrior, the man who would go down in history as both a builder and a destroyer. Mobutu didn't just rule Zaire, he dominated it. Once in power, he banned political parties, silenced dissent, and made himself synonymous with the state. Mobutu's vision wasn't entirely without merit. He wanted to create a unified national identity, something Congolese people could be proud of. Under his policy of authenticity, colonial names were replaced, traditional dress was encouraged, and Zaire's culture was celebrated. It was ambitious, if a little theatrical. Mobutu's early years in power weren't all bad. For a brief moment, Zaire experienced a renaissance of sorts. Foreign investment poured in, roads were built, schools opened, and major infrastructure projects like the Inga Dam were launched. It seemed for a while that Mobutu might fulfill his promise to modernize Zaire. The Inga Dam, one of Mobutu's most ambitious projects, was designed to harness the power of the Congo River. If fully realized, it could have turned Zaire into an industrial powerhouse. And for a time, it symbolized hope, a future where Zaire's resources served its people. Mobutu also played a prominent role on the global stage. He positioned Zaire as a leader in Africa, hosted the famous 1974 Rumble in the Jungle boxing match between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, and supported liberation movements in neighboring countries. These moves earned him admiration at home and abroad. But behind the facade of progress lay a darker truth. Mobutu's kleptocracy, his system of systemic corruption, ensured that every dollar of foreign aid, every cent of resource wealth, flowed directly into his pockets. Over 3 decades, Mobutu looted an estimated $5 billion from Zaire, leaving the nation's economy in ruins. And while Mobutu enriched himself, his people suffered. Schools went unfunded, hospitals collapsed, and roads, once a symbol of his modernization efforts, crumbled into disrepair. By the 1980s, Zaire's economy was on life support. Here's the thing, Mobutu didn't act alone. His kleptocracy was propped up by the West. To Washington and Brussels, Mobutu wasn't just a corrupt dictator, he was a strategic ally. He kept communists at bay, ensured the flow of minerals like cobalt and uranium, and allowed Western corporations to operate freely. The Cold War was in full swing, and the US and Europe were willing to pay any price to keep Zaire in the Western camp, even if that meant turning a blind eye to Mobutu's crimes. Western leaders knew about Mobutu's corruption. They knew about the suffering of Zaire's people, but they chose stability over justice, profit over accountability. Mobutu's rule was a study in contradictions. He celebrated Zaire's culture while selling off its resources to foreign interests. He promised prosperity while stashing billions abroad. And while he built symbols of progress like the Inga Dam, he left the vast majority of his people in poverty. Mobutu's own words captured the essence of his regime, a system where corruption wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. His inner circle grew rich, while Zaire became one of the world's poorest nations. Mobutu's rule was more than just a tragedy for Zaire, it was a cautionary tale. For a moment, he brought hope, unity, and a vision of progress. But that moment was fleeting. His greed, combined with Western complicity, turned Zaire into a kleptocracy, a nation where the wealth of the land served everyone except its people. And as Zaire's economy crumbled, Mobutu's grip on power began to weaken. The cracks in his regime were growing, and the end was closer than he realized. By the 1980s, Mobutu's empire was beginning to fracture. For over a decade, his kleptocracy had thrived on Cold War politics and Western support. But as the Cold War cooled, so did the West's willingness to bankroll Mobutu's regime. Aid slowed, resource revenues dwindled, and Zaire's economy, already on shaky ground, collapsed. For ordinary Congolese, the cracks in Mobutu's regime weren't just political, they were personal. Food prices skyrocketed, public servants went unpaid, and basic infrastructure, already neglected, began to collapse. The promises of progress Mobutu had once made now rang hollow. Frustration turned to anger, and anger turned to action. Across Zaire, protests erupted. Students, labor unions, and opposition groups united to challenge Mobutu's rule. For the first time in decades, his grip on the nation seemed less certain. But Mobutu wasn't ready to give up power. He responded with brutal repression. Political activists were jailed, opposition leaders disappeared, and soldiers were sent to crush protests with deadly force. The 1980s didn't just mark a turning point for Zaire, it marked a turning point for the world. The Cold War was winding down, and the United States no longer needed Mobutu as a bulwark against communism. The billions of dollars that once flowed into Zaire's coffers slowed to a trickle. Without Cold War politics to shield him, Mobutu found himself increasingly isolated. Western leaders who had once celebrated him as a stabilizing force began to see him for what he was, a liability. Even within Mobutu's inner circle, cracks began to form. For decades, his cronies had enriched themselves alongside him. But as the economy crumbled, loyalty gave way to self-preservation. Ministers and generals began siphoning even more from state coffers, further weakening the regime. There was no trust anymore. Everyone was stealing as much as they could, preparing for the inevitable collapse. Mobutu's once loyal allies began plotting their exits, stashing their wealth abroad, and quietly making contact with opposition groups. The regime was rotting from the inside. Mobutu's once magnetic aura began to fade. Public appearances became less frequent, and when he did speak, his words often felt disconnected from the reality his people faced. Rumors of his declining health swirled, and his grip on power seemed to loosen. Mobutu turned to his military to maintain control, but even his army was crumbling. Soldiers went unpaid for months, leading to widespread looting and desertions. Meanwhile, rebel groups in the east, emboldened by Mobutu's weakness, began to mobilize. By the late 1980s, Mobutu's once solid international support had eroded. Human rights organizations exposed the brutality of his regime, and Western media began to question the decades of aid that had propped him up. The narrative was shifting. Mobutu was no longer seen as a stabilizing force in Central Africa. He was seen as the root of its instability. And as the Cold War ended, even his staunchest allies began to abandon him. Mobutu's downfall didn't happen in isolation. It was tied to one of the most devastating events of the late 20th century, the Rwandan genocide. The genocide, its precursors, and its aftermath set off a chain reaction that not only changed the course of Rwandan history, but also brought an end to Mobutu's 32-year rule. By the late 1980s, ethnic tensions in Rwanda were boiling over. The Hutu-dominated government cracked down on the minority Tutsi population, forcing thousands to flee into neighboring countries, including Zaire. These tensions would soon spill across borders, dragging Mobutu's Zaire into a conflict it wasn't prepared to handle. Mobutu's role was complicated. He saw himself as a regional power broker, hosting summits and mediating disputes. But his kleptocratic governance and the weakening of Zaire's state apparatus left his country ill-equipped to handle the growing influx of refugees and the violence that followed. In 1994, Rwanda descended into horror. Over 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered in just 100 days. As the genocide unfolded, Mobutu's regime watched helplessly from across the border. When the RPF, led by Paul Kagame, took control of Rwanda, millions of Hutu refugees, many of them perpetrators of the genocide, fled into Zaire. Among them were members of the Interahamwe militia, who used refugee camps as bases to regroup and launch attacks back into Rwanda. Eastern Zaire became a powder keg. Mobutu's weak state couldn't manage the influx of refugees or the growing violence in the region. The chaos in these camps set the stage for what would become the First Congo War. For Rwanda and Uganda, Mobutu wasn't just a problem, he was a threat. His inability to control eastern Zaire allowed genocidal militias to operate freely, threatening Kagame's new government in Rwanda. In 1996, Rwanda and Uganda decided to act. They backed Laurent Désiré Kabila and his alliance of democratic forces for the liberation of Congo, using him as a proxy to overthrow Mobutu. But let's be clear, this wasn't just about ending Mobutu's reign. Rwanda and Uganda had their own interests: control of Zaire's resources, particularly the lucrative mines in Katanga and Kivu. The First Congo War was swift and decisive. Kabila's forces, backed by Rwandan and Ugandan troops, advanced rapidly across Zaire. Mobutu's army, unpaid and demoralized, collapsed without much of a fight. Town after town fell as Kabila's forces marched toward Kinshasa. For the people of Zaire, the war was both a liberation and a tragedy. While many welcomed the end of Mobutu's rule, the violence and displacement caused by the conflict left scars that would take generations to heal. By 1997, Mobutu's health had deteriorated. Diagnosed with prostate cancer, he spent much of his time seeking treatment abroad. When Kabila's forces reached the outskirts of Kinshasa, Mobutu fled to Morocco, leaving behind a nation in ruins. It was an unceremonious end for a man who had ruled Zaire with an iron fist for over 3 decades. Mobutu died months later in exile, far from the palaces and power he once cherished. Kabila's victory marked the end of Mobutu's reign, but it didn't bring peace to Congo. Rwanda and Uganda, once Kabila's allies, turned against him, sparking the Second Congo War, Africa's deadliest conflict since World War II. The very forces that brought him to power now sought to control him. The First Congo War didn't just end Mobutu's rule. It set off a chain reaction of violence and exploitation that continues to shape Congo today. Mobutu's fall was inevitable, but the scars of his rule and the conflicts that followed remain. The Rwandan genocide, the First Congo War, and the greed of regional and global powers ensured that Congo's pain didn't end with Mobutu's exile. Instead, it deepened. Mobutu may be gone, but his legacy lives on in the corruption he normalized, the divisions he exploited, and the resources he squandered. Congo's story is far from over, but its people continue to fight for the justice, stability, and prosperity they deserve. Mobutu wasn't an anomaly. He was a product of the Cold War, a chess piece moved by the hands of foreign powers. The United States and Europe didn't just tolerate Mobutu's regime, they enabled it. They looked the other way as he siphoned billions from his country, as long as he kept communism at bay and Congo's resources flowing to the West. Politics was prioritized over people, profit over justice. And Congo, it's still paying the price. Congo is one of the richest nations on Earth, in resources, in culture, in potential. Yet it remains one of the poorest in terms of human development. This is Mobutu's legacy, a nation looted from within and exploited from without. The corruption Mobutu normalized still lingers in Congo's political fabric. The divisions he exploited continue to fracture the country, and the resources he squandered remain the target of foreign corporations and regional powers. The scars of his rule are deep, and they haven't healed. But Congo's story isn't just one of suffering, it's also one of resilience. For decades, its people have endured exploitation and conflict, yet they continue to fight for justice, for stability, for a future where Congo's wealth serves its people, not foreign interests. The Congolese people have never stopped dreaming of a better future. They've faced dictatorship, war, and exploitation, but their spirit remains unbroken. Congo's story isn't over, and neither is its fight for justice. Mobutu's story isn't unique. It's one chapter in a much larger book about how Cold War politics shaped the modern world. Leaders like Mobutu were propped up, not for the benefit of their people, but for the convenience of foreign powers. And the consequences? They're still unfolding. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a warning. When global powers prioritize profits and geopolitics over people, the cost is paid in lives, in lost potential, and in the suffering of future generations. Mobutu may be gone, but his legacy lingers, in Congo and beyond. The question now is, will the world finally listen? Will we acknowledge the mistakes of the past and work toward a future where nations like Congo can thrive, free from exploitation and corruption? Congo's people are ready. They've always been ready. The question is, are we? Mobutu's story is just the beginning. It's one piece of a much larger puzzle about power, betrayal, and resilience. If you want to uncover more of the stories they don't teach you in school, hit subscribe. Trust me, this is just the start.